Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and in this video series we're going to talk about something called epistemology. And that's a really big word, and I don't want to start with some definitions, which we'll get to in a moment, but instead I want to start with Scripture itself and show that this topic, which may seem a little bit outside of what we would normally consider as theology or doctrine or relevant Christian subject matter, is in fact a biblical topic that needs to be discussed. And so I want to start by looking at Romans chapter 1 and a little bit into Romans chapter 2. And the background here is that Paul is writing in these first couple chapters of Romans about how not only the Jews, but also the Greeks are in need of Christ. And so to establish their need for Christ, he has to establish that they're all sinners. And an obvious question comes forward. If you read the New Testament, you can see that what Christ does through his sacrificial death, his resurrection, is to redeem us from the condemnation we received from the law of Moses. But the only nation that was in covenant with God through the law of Moses was the nation of Israel. What about all these Gentile nations? If they're not obligated to God through the covenant of Moses, if they're not a part of that covenant, why is it that they need to be redeemed from breaking that covenant? And so Paul is going to talk about some reasons and the basis for condemning the Gentiles, even though they didn't have the law of Moses. And if you want to look specifically, you can see in chapter 2, verses 10 through 15, Paul's going to address that very explicitly. But it's the backdrop for these entire first couple chapters of Romans, and it's with that in mind that we find what we find in chapter 1 of Romans. And so I want to start in verse 18, and it says, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness." Now, who is Paul talking about? Mankind in general, and including those who are unrighteous. In verse 19 he says, "Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them." Who is them here? Mankind in general, including the unrighteous. That which may be known of God is manifest for them or in them. The unrighteous and all mankind in general have the knowledge of God. At least they started with it. That's going to be Paul's argument. How does he say that? How could he possibly say that? He continues in verse 19 after saying God is manifest in them. He says, "For God has showed it unto them." When? Through some sort of inward revelation or some prophets coming to all the nations, or individuals when they're in their own private time that God shows up in their heart of hearts and their consciousness, they somehow automatically know this? Is that what Paul's going to say, that it's that kind of subjective understanding that we have from God? And he answers that in verse 20. He says, "For God has showed it to them, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world," going all the way back from Adam and Eve, all that long period of time down to the time when Paul's writing. Over all that period of time, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So Paul's saying over the entire course of human history, before the law of Moses and even with the Gentiles since the law of Moses, the knowledge of God has been not only available to all mankind, but he's going to say they actually had it, they understood it, and they let go of it. They gave it up. But they're understood, they were perceivable, detectable, they had been deduced. The things of God, who he was, that he existed, and even morality had been deduced from those things which were visible. And I'll give you an example of this and how this works. And by the way, scholars talk about this sometimes as natural theology, or Paul's natural theology, because the idea is that theology in this part of Romans can be deduced from what's available in the natural world. And so one example of this would be that, well, how would you determine morality concerning proper marriage and true marriage and that kind of situation, and what is fornication and what is condemned as inappropriate activity in that sense? And we see Jesus making this argument, so I'd say Paul is making his argument based on what Jesus said, and that is to go back to Adam and Eve. You have a man and you have a woman, and you can detect from the differences between men and women and how they interact with each other concerning reproduction, the idea of them functioning as a unit. And from that you get the ability to derive the rest of morality to some extent, that God intends for a man and a woman to be one flesh and to stay that way, and that they are united by God because that's the way God created them. So the unity is there by means of the way God created them. So the way God created visible things reveals to us certain things about morality. And so that's one example of how that works. And Paul, that's what Paul's describing here concerning the Gentiles who didn't have the law, and also concerning all mankind before Moses gave the law, that late date in history, which was thousands of years after creation. In verse 21 he says, "Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened." In this entire scenario, mankind doesn't start off in a state of ignorance, not as a group and not as individuals from the time of creation all the way to Moses and all the way to Jesus Christ. Instead, they start off with a state of knowledge, particularly as a collective group, and that knowledge is based on what is objectively, universally available in the created world, what they can see around them, like we've been talking about and Paul's been talking about. He says in verse 22, they became fools. In verse 25, he says they changed the truth of God into a lie, all demonstrating that they started with the truth. In verse 28, he says they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. And in verse 29 to 31, we find this laundry list of sins. He says, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. How many of the 10 Commandments has Paul just listed here so far? And yet he's saying this is before the 10 Commandments. This is from the creation of the world, thousands of years before they had Moses and the law. These things were not revealed by means of a prophet, but they were revealed by means of the world itself. And so he concludes here in verse 32, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Paul says not only is the Godhead clearly determinable, clearly able to be understood by the creation of the world and the visible things that we can see all around us, but morality also. And we gave an example of that concerning marriage already. All of these things can be deduced, and in fact were deduced by men from the creation of the world, all those centuries down until the time of Moses, and even among the Gentiles after that. So that Paul writes in chapter 2 that the Gentiles who didn't have the law were a law unto themselves if they obeyed based on what they knew in nature, from nature itself. And so this is the context that Paul's talking about this here. And again, early in chapter 2, in verse 1, Paul says, therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whoever thou art that judges. For wherein thou dost judge another, you condemn yourself. For you that judge do the same things. So here's objectivity again. It's not just objectivity in the sense that the facts about God and morality are available to everybody in the visible world all around them. That's objective for sure. But also, there's objectivity in the sense that what's true for one person is true for another. It's not a matter of your subjective morality is different for you and then someone else's subjective morality is different for them. But it's universally true. When you see some person doing something that's wrong, you know it's wrong because you would know it was wrong if that person did it to you. You would complain, and so you shouldn't do it to them either. So there's an objectivity in that as well. And what is being condemned here is sort of a subjective point of view concerning morality and God, right? That in contrast to those things which were clearly visible to everyone about God and about morality, that instead you have the going into vain imaginations, as Paul says in verse 21. That instead of the truth of God, which is visible and plain to everyone, and the visible things that are made since the creation of the world, you have the idea of imaginations. That people would choose the things that they imagine in their own minds. And Paul says this elsewhere, right, where he talks in Corinthians about the idea of taking captive every vain imagination that exalts itself against the knowledge of Christ. And so this is imaginations and things that are conjured up in the mind, and people make them up and make believe and they pretend them to be true, in contrast to those things which are readily available to everyone, seen in the visible world. In this point in time that we have today, they're visibly attested through the record of the Scriptures as well, and confirmed in the writings of the prophets for the prophecies that came to pass. All of these types of objective proofs that we see that are available to everyone. So Paul is presenting a picture here of objectivity, and he's contrasting that with the idea of subjectivity. And so we're going to talk a lot about those two words today and what they mean and how they relate to this concept of epistemology. Because epistemology is essentially the subject or the study of knowledge and where we get knowledge from and how we know things and how certain it can be. And so we're going to get into some definitions for that in the next video. But if we jump for a second right up to the top of this passage in verse 17 of Romans chapter 1, we see that Paul says, there is a righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. The just shall live by faith. And so Paul's not talking about something that changed with the new covenant, that suddenly we go from being able to determine things by looking at the world around us to living instead by faith. You have to ask the question, is Paul talking about reasoned faith here or blind faith? And I would argue that Paul's talking about reasoned faith in the context, things that you can look at in the world around you and determine that are true. And that would include things like the historical record of the Bible itself as a piece of evidence for us to reason and consider. And so we'll be talking about these issues in this video, and we'll come back in just a second and some basic definitions.